The rain fell in relentless sheets against the stained glass windows of Blackwood Manor's chapel, as if heaven itself mourned the passing of Duke Sebastian Blackwood. Eleanor Ashford stood motionless in the back corner of the grand hall, her black mourning dress borrowed and ill-fitting, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Before her, arranged in solemn rows, sat the cream of English society, lords and ladies who had never once acknowledged her existence during the 3 years she had served as governess in this very house. And there, at the pulpit, Bishop Cornelius Thorne delivered his eulogy with the practiced grace of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. His voice rolled through the chapel like thunder, speaking of honor and virtue, of a man who had lived his life in service to God and country, of a nobleman whose legacy would shine as a beacon for generations to come. Each word felt like a blade against Eleanor's heart, for she alone knew the terrible lie at the center of this theatrical display of mourning. 72 hours earlier, Eleanor had been summoned to the Duke's bedchamber in the dead of night, her heart pounding with the fear that she was about to be dismissed without reference or means. She had climbed those marble stairs with trembling legs, expecting to face the cold, imperious man who had barely spoken 10 words to her in 3 years, the widower who had retreated so completely into his grief after losing his first wife that the servants whispered he had become more ghost than man. Instead, she found Sebastian Blackwood propped against silk pillows, his once powerful frame wasted by illness, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to consume what little life remained in his body. He had looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she had arrived at Blackwood Manor as a frightened girl of 19, orphaned and desperate for any position that would keep her from the workhouse. And then he had asked the impossible. He wanted her to marry him immediately that very night, in a ceremony that would be witnessed only by his physician, his solicitor, and the bishop himself. The proposal had not been born of love or even affection, Sebastian explained in a voice barely above a whisper, but of cold necessity, and perhaps a flicker of something that might have been remorse. His distant cousins, vultures who had been circling the estate for months, would descend upon his fortune the moment he died, contesting his will and tearing apart everything he had built. But if he had a wife, a legal widow, his wishes would be unassailable under English law. Eleanor would inherit everything: the manor, the fortune, the title of duchess. In exchange, she need only play the role of grieving widow for a respectable period and never reveal the transactional nature of their union. For a woman who possessed nothing but the worn dresses on her back and the education that had been her only inheritance from a bankrupt father, the offer was dizzying, impossible, and yet undeniably real. She had agreed, not out of greed, but out of something far more complicated, a desperate hunger for security, yes, but also an unexpected compassion for this dying man who had, in his final hours, chosen to see her as more than invisible. Bishop Thorne had arrived within the hour, his face a mask of ecclesiastical disapproval, barely concealed beneath practiced courtesy. He had conducted the ceremony with mechanical efficiency, his cold eyes moving between Eleanor and the dying Duke with unconcealed distaste. But after Sebastian had signed the marriage certificate with a shaking hand, after the witnesses had departed, and Eleanor believed the ordeal complete, the bishop had requested a private audience with the new duchess. What followed was not a conversation, but an act of spiritual extortion so calculated that Eleanor understood, even in her shock, that she had been outmaneuvered by a master manipulator. The bishop spoke of scandal, of the appearance of impropriety, of how society would interpret her sudden elevation from servant to duchess. The church, he explained with false gentleness, required assurance of her moral character. She would need to make a public declaration that the marriage had been one of pure convenience, that she harbored no romantic feelings for the Duke, that she had merely performed a Christian duty for a dying man. More than that, she would commit half of her inheritance to the church's charitable works as penance for the unseemly circumstances of her marriage. These conditions were not requests but requirements if she wished to avoid being branded a fortune hunter and social pariah. Eleanor had felt her soul fracturing as she agreed to the bishop's terms, understanding too late that her promised freedom had come with chains of a different kind. She had returned to Sebastian's bedside to find him barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. He had reached for her hand with surprising strength and pulled her close, whispering words that would haunt her forever. That he was sorry, that she deserved better, that she should forgive him for what was to come. She had not understood what he meant, had assumed he was apologizing for the burden of widowhood he was placing upon her young shoulders. He died 3 hours later, just as dawn broke over the frost-covered grounds of Blackwood Manor, and Eleanor became a duchess and a widow in the same breath, bound by promises to both a dead man and a living demon clothed in ecclesiastical robes. Now, as Bishop Thorne's voice rose to its crescendo, praising the Duke's unwavering faith and moral fortitude, Eleanor felt the weight of her bargain settling over her like a burial shroud. Tomorrow she would stand before these same people and speak the words the bishop had scripted for her, words that would transform her from duchess to opportunist, from wife to cautionary tale. She would surrender half of everything Sebastian had given her, not to God's work, but to Cornelius Thorne's ambition. And she would carry the secret of that final night, of Sebastian's unexpected tenderness, of his whispered apology, of the humanity she had glimpsed beneath his cold exterior, into a future that suddenly seemed more like a prison than a palace. The bishop's voice echoed through the chapel, speaking of virtue while executing vice, and Eleanor closed her eyes against the tears she could not afford to shed, wondering what price her soul would ultimately pay for a fortune she was no longer certain she wanted. The path that had led Eleanor Ashford to Blackwood Manor 3 years prior had been paved with loss and desperation, each step a surrender of the life she had once imagined for herself. She had been the cherished only daughter of Thomas Ashford, a country vicar, whose modest living had provided a comfortable if unremarkable childhood in the village of Thornfield. Her father had been a man of books and gentle philosophy, who had taught her Greek and Latin alongside her prayers, who had filled their small rectory with the works of poets and historians, never imagining that such an education would become both her salvation and her curse. When fever took him during her 18th winter, Eleanor discovered that comfort and security were illusions as fragile as morning frost. Her father had died owing debts she had never known existed, borrowed against expectations of church preferment that never materialized. The rectory was claimed by the parish, her father's books sold to settle accounts, and Eleanor found herself alone in the world with nothing but an educated mind that society considered an unmarketable eccentricity in a woman. For 6 months she had survived on the charity of her father's former parishioners, each week bringing fresh humiliation as she moved from household to household, always temporary, always one step from destitution. She had applied for every governess position advertised in the county, but her lack of references and connections made her invisible to families seeking proper instruction for their daughters. It was Mrs. Whitmore, the vicar's wife who had replaced her father, who finally secured the position at Blackwood Manor through a distant connection to the Duke's housekeeper. The wages were modest but regular, the duties clearly defined. She would tutor the Duke's young ward, Miss Caroline Hartley, a distant cousin's daughter who had been orphaned and brought to Blackwood Manor for upbringing. Eleanor had arrived at the imposing estate on a grey November morning, her single trunk containing everything she owned, her heart heavy with gratitude and grief in equal measure. The Duke Sebastian Blackwood she encountered upon her arrival was nothing like the man who would later ask her to marry him on his deathbed. He had been 42 years old, in the prime of his power and influence, a man whose presence seemed to fill whatever room he occupied. Yet there was something profoundly broken about him, a quality of emotional absence that the servants whispered about in corners. His wife, the beloved Duchess Marianne, had died 2 years earlier in childbirth, taking their unborn son with her, and Sebastian had responded by retreating so completely into his duties and his grief that he became more administrator than human. He managed his vast estates with cold efficiency, appeared at Parliament when required, fulfilled every social obligation with mechanical precision, but there was no warmth in him, no spark of the man he had supposedly been before tragedy hollowed him out. Eleanor saw him rarely during those first years, usually only in passing as he moved through the manor's corridors, like an elegant spectre, his dark eyes looking through her rather than at her, as if governesses and servants existed in a dimension he could not quite perceive. Her life at Blackwood Manor had settled into a rhythm of quiet obscurity. She taught young Caroline history and literature, mathematics and French, finding unexpected joy in the girl's quick mind and gentle nature. She took her meals in the nursery, attended Sunday services in the Manor's chapel, and spent her few free hours in the library, the one place where the Duke's indifference to her existence became a gift. The vast collection of books became her refuge, and her secret education continued, expanded beyond what her father had taught her. She read philosophy and poetry, histories of ancient Rome, and contemporary accounts of the American Revolution, filling her mind with worlds she would never see and ideas she could never voice. The other servants treated her with the peculiar isolation reserved for those who existed between stations, too educated to be truly one of them, too poor and low-born to be anything else. It was a lonely existence, but Eleanor had learned to find contentment in small things. The satisfaction of watching Caroline master a difficult Latin translation, the peace of the library at twilight, the security of knowing she would not starve or freeze. She had convinced herself that this half-life was enough, that wanting more was the pride that came before destruction. She had not known that Sebastian Blackwood watched her sometimes from the shadows of the library door, observing her complete absorption in books, the way her face transformed when lost in ideas. She had not known that her quiet competence and invisible grace had registered in some locked chamber of his grieving heart. She had not known that 3 years of patient endurance were about to culminate in a single night that would transform her from invisible governess into a duchess bound by chains she could not yet see. The morning after the funeral dawned cold and merciless, and Eleanor found herself seated in the drawing room of Blackwood Manor, surrounded by faces that regarded her with expressions ranging from barely concealed contempt to outright hostility. The Duke's solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, had gathered the family, distant cousins who had materialized like carrion birds the moment news of Sebastian's death reached London, to read the will. Eleanor sat apart from them, her borrowed mourning dress a stark reminder of how little she truly belonged in this world of inherited privilege. Lady Cordelia Blackwood, Sebastian's second cousin and a woman whose beauty was matched only by her viciousness, had positioned herself prominently near the fireplace, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Eleanor with undisguised loathing. Beside her sat Lord Marcus Blackwood, Sebastian's cousin and the man who would have inherited everything had Eleanor not existed, his handsome face a mask of controlled fury that promised future retribution. When Mr. Pemberton announced that Eleanor was not merely the Duke's widow, but the sole beneficiary of his entire fortune, the room erupted in barely restrained chaos. Lady Cordelia's voice rose above the others, demanding to know by what sorcery a mere governess had ensnared a dying man, what arts of manipulation she had employed to steal an inheritance that belonged by blood to the Blackwood family. Lord Marcus was more controlled but infinitely more dangerous, his questions cutting like surgical instruments as he suggested impropriety, questioned the validity of a marriage conducted in secret, implied without quite stating that Eleanor had taken advantage of a man not in his right mind. Eleanor sat frozen through it all, her hands folded in her lap, understanding that every word she spoke would be twisted into evidence of her guilt, every defense interpreted as confirmation of their accusations. The weight of Bishop Thorne's bargain pressed down upon her with suffocating force. Tomorrow she would have to stand before society and confirm every terrible thing they believed about her. The days that followed the reading of the will became a gauntlet of social torture that Eleanor had never imagined possible. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood, mistress of one of England's great estates, possessor of a fortune that included properties across 3 counties, investments in shipping and railroads, and an income that exceeded the annual budgets of small towns. Yet she had never felt more powerless or more alone. The servants, who had once treated her with distant politeness, now regarded her with suspicion and resentment, whispering behind their hands about how she had schemed her way from the nursery to the ducal bedchamber. Invitations that should have flooded in for a newly titled duchess never materialized. Society had already judged her and found her wanting. She wandered the grand rooms of Blackwood Manor like a ghost haunting her own life, sleeping in the duchess's chambers that still smelled faintly of lavender and loss, eating solitary meals in a dining room built to host 40 guests, understanding too late that Sebastian had given her everything except the one thing that mattered: acceptance. Bishop Thorne visited regularly during those first weeks, ostensibly to provide spiritual comfort to the grieving widow, but Eleanor knew better. Each visit was a reminder of the performance she would soon have to give, the public confession of her supposed opportunism that would satisfy society's hunger for scandal while enriching the church's coffers. The bishop would sit in Sebastian's study, helping himself to the late Duke's brandy, and review the speech he had written for her, making small adjustments to maximize its impact. She was to deliver it at the month's memorial service before the assembled nobility and gentry of the county. She would declare that the Duke had married her out of legal necessity rather than affection, that she had agreed to the arrangement as an act of Christian charity rather than romantic love, and that she recognized the unseemly nature of her elevation by donating half her inheritance to the church's mission work. The bishop spoke of this public humiliation as if it were a gift he was bestowing upon her, a chance to redeem herself in the eyes of God and society. But Eleanor heard the truth beneath his honeyed words. This was the price of her survival, and he would extract every ounce of dignity she possessed. Yet even as Eleanor prepared herself for this ritualized destruction of her character, strange things began to happen at Blackwood Manor. Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor, requested several private meetings with her, his manner oddly urgent and conspiratorial. He spoke carefully, as if testing the boundaries of attorney-client privilege, suggesting that she should not make any irreversible decisions about the estate until certain matters were fully settled. When she pressed him for clarity, he would only say that the Duke had been a man of extraordinary foresight, and that she should trust in his provisions. Then there was the locked study on the 3rd floor, Sebastian's private sanctuary that even the servants had been forbidden to enter during his lifetime. Mr. Pemberton had given her the key with specific instructions. She was to go there alone when the house was quiet and open the mahogany cabinet behind the desk. Inside, he promised, she would find letters, correspondence that the Duke had written in the final weeks of his life, documents that would illuminate his true intentions and perhaps offer her a path she had not yet imagined. Eleanor kept that key hidden in her bodice, feeling its weight against her heart like a promise or a threat, waiting for the courage to discover what final message Sebastian Blackwood had left for the wife he had known for less than a day. On the night before she was scheduled to deliver her humiliating confession to society, Eleanor finally summoned the courage to climb the stairs to Sebastian's private study. The manor was silent save for the grandfather clock in the entrance hall, marking midnight with sonorous chimes, and she moved through the darkened corridors with a single candle, her heart hammering against her ribs. The key felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hand as she unlocked the door to the room that had been Sebastian's final refuge from the world. The study was exactly as he had left it, leather-bound books lining the walls, a half-finished glass of port on the desk, papers covered in his precise handwriting scattered across the surface as if he had simply stepped away and might return at any moment. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling like an intruder in this intimate space, before forcing herself to cross to the mahogany cabinet Mr. Pemberton had described. Inside the cabinet, arranged with careful deliberation, were dozens of letters bound in silk ribbon, each bundle labelled with dates spanning the final 6 weeks of Sebastian's life. Eleanor's hands shook as she carried them to the desk, settling into the chair that still held the faint impression of his form, and began to read by candlelight. What she discovered in those pages shattered every assumption she had made about the man she had married. The letters revealed that Sebastian's illness had not come upon him suddenly. He had known for nearly 2 months that he was dying, had consulted with physicians in London who confirmed that his heart was failing and that no treatment could save him. But rather than retreat into despair, he had begun a careful investigation into the vultures already circling his estate, documenting the letters from his cousins that revealed their plans to contest his will, their schemes to declare him mentally incompetent, their barely concealed greed disguised as family concern. More astonishing still were the letters Sebastian had written but never sent, drafts and revisions that chronicled his growing awareness of Eleanor herself. He had noticed her, it seemed, far earlier than she had ever imagined, had observed her kindness to young Caroline, her fierce intelligence, wasted on a world that had no use for educated women without fortune or family. He wrote of watching her in the library, of being struck by the grace with which she bore her invisible existence, of recognizing in her something he had lost when Marianne died. Not a replacement for his first love, but a different kind of courage, a quiet resilience that made his own grief seem almost self-indulgent. The entries grew more personal as his illness progressed, revealing a man wrestling with an impossible decision. He could see that Eleanor deserved so much more than the half-life of a governess. Yet he also understood that offering her his name and fortune would mark her as a target for society's cruelest judgments. The most devastating letters were those Sebastian had written to Bishop Thorn, copies he had kept of their correspondence that revealed the churchman's true nature with brutal clarity. Sebastian had approached the bishop to perform the marriage ceremony, believing he was securing Eleanor's future through proper ecclesiastical channels. But Thorn had immediately sensed an opportunity for profit and had replied with thinly veiled threats. He would perform the ceremony, but only if certain conditions were met, conditions that would ensure the church's financial benefit and his own moral authority. Sebastian's response letters showed his growing horror as he realized he had delivered Eleanor into the hands of a sophisticated extortionist, a man who wielded religious authority like a weapon to extract wealth from the vulnerable. The Duke had tried to find another solution, had consulted with other clergy, but time was running out and Thorn had made it clear that any attempt to circumvent his authority would result in him publicly questioning the validity of the marriage itself. In the final bundle of letters, dated from the last week of Sebastian's life, Eleanor found something that stopped her breath entirely, a complete dossier on Bishop Cornelius Thorn compiled by a London investigator. The documents detailed years of similar schemes, grieving widows pressured into excessive donations, dying men convinced to alter their wills in the church's favor, young women from good families who had made indiscretions and paid crushing sums for the bishop's silence. There were bank records showing how donations to the church's charitable works mysteriously flowed into private accounts, controlled by Thorn himself, property deeds revealing estates purchased with funds that should have fed the poor, testimony from former victims too frightened to speak publicly, but willing to provide written statements. And clipped to this evidence was a letter in Sebastian's handwriting, addressed to Eleanor, dated the day before their wedding. He had discovered Thorn's corruption too late to protect her from the initial bargain, but he had gathered the weapons she would need to free herself, to expose the bishop, and reclaim not just her fortune but her dignity, and he begged her forgiveness for leaving her to fight a battle he should have finished himself. Helena sat frozen at Sebastian's desk as dawn light began to filter through the study windows. The letters spread before her like a map to a country she had not known existed. Her mind reeled with the implications of what she had discovered. Sebastian had not merely given her a fortune, he had given her a weapon, and with it, the choice to either submit to Bishop Thorn's extortion or to fight back with evidence that could destroy one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in England. The final letter, written in Sebastian's increasingly unsteady hand, just hours before he summoned her to his bedchamber, revealed the full depth of his strategy and his torment. He had known that Thorn would demand her public humiliation as the price of social acceptance, had anticipated every move in the bishop's calculated assault on her dignity, and had left her the means to turn the tables completely. But he had also written with heartbreaking honesty that he could not make this choice for her, that exposing Thorn would invite scandal and danger, that fighting back might cost her the very respectability she sought, and that he had no right to ask her to become a warrior, when all she had wanted was safety. What struck Eleanor most profoundly as she read and reread Sebastian's words was the gradual revelation of the man himself, layers of grief and duty peeling away to expose someone far more complex than the cold duke who had barely acknowledged her existence. He wrote of Marianne, his first wife, with a love that had never diminished but had evolved from raw agony into tender memory. He described how her death had not merely broken his heart, but had shattered his faith in his own judgment. He had been unable to save her, unable to protect the child she had carried, and in his guilt and rage he had withdrawn from all human connection as a form of self-punishment. For 2 years he had existed rather than lived, performing his duties with mechanical precision, while the essential part of himself remained entombed with Marianne. But watching Eleanor, he wrote, had begun to thaw something he thought permanently frozen, not because she reminded him of his first wife, but because her quiet strength in the face of invisibility and injustice had reminded him that life could be endured with grace, that suffering did not have to calcify into coldness. In the final pages, Sebastian confessed something that made Eleanor's tears fall onto the aged paper, blurring the ink. He had come to care for her, truly and deeply, in those last weeks of his life. It had not been the passionate romance of his youth, but something perhaps more profound, a recognition of kinship, of shared understanding between two people whom life had tried to render invisible in different ways. He had wanted to give her everything not out of obligation or legal maneuvering, but because in her he saw someone who would use power and wealth not for selfish gain, but for genuine good. Someone who understood the weight of responsibility because she had lived without any power at all. His greatest regret, he wrote, was that he had waited until death's door to truly see her, that he had wasted 3 years of proximity in which they might have become friends, confidants, perhaps even something more. The marriage he had proposed was not the relationship he wished he could have offered her, but it was all the time he had left would allow, and he hoped, desperately hoped, that she would not hate him for making her a duchess under such impossible circumstances. The final paragraph of Sebastian's last letter contained instructions that were both gift and burden. He had arranged for Mr. Pemberton to serve as her advocate and protector, had endowed the solicitor with complete authority to act in her interests regardless of what she chose to do with the evidence against Thorn. If she decided to submit to the bishop's demands, to deliver the humiliating speech and surrender half her fortune for the sake of peace and acceptance, Sebastian would understand and support that choice from beyond the grave. The remaining wealth would still be more than enough to secure her future. But if she chose to fight, if she decided that her dignity and the dignity of Thorn's other victims mattered more than society's approval, then Pemberton had been instructed to deploy the evidence strategically, to coordinate with journalists and reformers who had long suspected the bishop's corruption but lacked proof. Sebastian acknowledged that this path would be dangerous, that Thorn had powerful allies and would not go down without attempting to destroy her first. But he had faith, unearned perhaps, but absolute, that Eleanor possessed the courage and intelligence to outmaneuver even the most sophisticated predator. As the morning sun fully illuminated the study, Eleanor carefully gathered all the letters and evidence, her hands no longer trembling but steady with a resolve she had not known she possessed. For 3 years she had been invisible, had accepted invisibility as the natural condition of her existence, had been prepared to purchase a hollow version of respectability with her self-respect and half her inheritance. But Sebastian, in death, had given her something more valuable than wealth or title. He had given her the truth about her own worth, validated by a man who had no reason to lie, who had spent his final days ensuring she would have the choice he never had to fight back against those who treated people as commodities to be exploited. Eleanor understood now what Sebastian's whispered apology had meant in those final moments. He was sorry for leaving her alone to face this battle, sorry that his protection extended only as far as documents and evidence rather than his living presence beside her. But he had also given her something else in those letters, the knowledge that she had been seen, truly seen, by someone whose judgment she had come to trust, and that being seen had transformed her understanding of who she might become. Eleanor spent the morning of the memorial service in a state of crystalline clarity, moving through her preparations with the calm precision of a general preparing for battle. She bathed and dressed in the finest morning gown Sebastian's fortune could provide. Black silk that whispered against her skin like a promise, her hair arranged in a style befitting a duchess rather than a governess playing dress-up. When her lady's maid stepped back to survey the result, Eleanor barely recognized the woman in the mirror, poised, elegant, and carrying herself with an authority that came not from birth or training, but from the bone-deep certainty that she would not be sacrificing herself on the altar of Bishop Thorn's greed. She had sent word to Mr. Pemberton in the early hours requesting his presence an hour before the service, and when the solicitor arrived, she handed him a sealed letter containing her instructions. He was to sit in the front row with the evidence carefully concealed in his document case, and he was to watch her closely during the proceedings, ready to act the moment she gave the signal they had arranged. The chapel at Blackwood Manor filled with the highest ranks of county society well before the appointed hour, everyone eager to witness what they assumed would be Eleanor's public degradation and the righteous triumph of ecclesiastical authority over presumptuous ambition. Lady Cordelia had positioned herself prominently with her coterie of similarly venomous women, their expressions hovering between satisfaction and barely suppressed glee. Lord Marcus sat with arms crossed and a smile playing at his lips, clearly anticipating that Eleanor's confession would provide grounds to challenge the will after all. If she admitted the marriage was merely transactional, perhaps a skilled barrister could argue it was invalid altogether. The pews were crowded with faces Eleanor recognized from her invisible years as governess. The families who had dined at Blackwood Manor and never once acknowledged her presence. The society matrons who had looked through her as if she were furniture. The eligible young men who had flirted with Caroline under Eleanor's supervision without ever seeing the woman who chaperoned them. They had all come to see justice, as they understood it, enacted upon someone who had dared to rise above her station. Bishop Cornelius Thorne entered last, his ecclesiastical robes flowing around him like dark water, his face arranged in an expression of solemn pastoral concern that concealed the predator's satisfaction beneath. He took his position at the pulpit with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle of wills, who understood that the weapons of shame and social pressure were more effective than any physical force. His opening remarks were masterpieces of subtle cruelty, speaking of the importance of humility and truth, of how the Lord valued an honest confession above all treasures, of how the Church stood ready to guide those who had strayed back onto the path of righteousness. Each word was carefully chosen to prime the audience for Eleanor's anticipated surrender, to frame her public humiliation as a redemptive act rather than an extortion. When he finally called Eleanor to stand before the congregation and deliver her prepared statement, his eyes met hers with absolute certainty that she would comply, that the fear of social annihilation would trump any impulse toward resistance. Eleanor rose from her seat with deliberate grace, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as she walked to the front of the chapel. She could sense their expectations like a physical presence, the anticipation of her shame, the hunger to see someone who had dared to reach beyond her place brought low, the satisfaction of watching the natural order reassert itself. She reached the pulpit and turned to face them, her hands resting calmly on the smooth wood, and for a long moment she simply stood there, letting the silence stretch and deepen until discomfort rippled through the crowd. This was the moment Bishop Thorne had scripted. She was supposed to deliver her confession of opportunism, to characterize her marriage to Sebastian as a calculated transaction devoid of genuine feeling, to announce her massive donation to the Church as penance for her presumption. The bishop stood to her right, close enough that she could hear his satisfied breathing, far enough that he appeared to be offering spiritual support rather than exercising control. But Eleanor did not reach for the prepared speech in her reticule. Instead, she began to speak in a voice that was quiet but carried perfectly through the chapel's acoustics, a voice that bore no trace of shame or apology, but something far more dangerous: absolute conviction. She spoke of Sebastian Blackwood, not as a symbol or a saint, but as a man who had suffered and grieved, who had made mistakes and sought to correct them, who had possessed the rare courage to see value in someone society deemed invisible. She described their marriage not as the transaction Bishop Thorne had demanded she portray it as, but as an act of mutual recognition between two people whom life had tried to break in different ways, an acknowledgement that worth was not determined by birth or wealth, but by the content of one's character and the grace with which one bore suffering. The audience stirred uncomfortably as Eleanor's narrative diverged from the expected script, and she could feel Bishop Thorne's growing tension beside her, but she continued steadily, building toward a revelation that would shatter far more than her own reputation. In the days following what society would come to call the Blackwood Chapel incident, Eleanor watched with quiet satisfaction as the edifice of Bishop Thorne's power collapsed with remarkable speed. The evidence Sebastian had compiled proved to be even more devastating than she had anticipated. Journalists seized upon the story with enthusiasm, painting vivid portraits of a corrupt churchman who had preyed upon the grieving and vulnerable for personal gain. The Archbishop's office, faced with undeniable documentation and mounting public pressure, had no choice but to suspend Thorne from his duties pending a full investigation, a suspension that everyone understood was merely a polite prelude to complete disgrace. Former victims, emboldened by Eleanor's public stand, began to come forward with their own stories, each account adding another layer to the pattern of exploitation that had operated hidden in plain sight for years. Within a fortnight, Bishop Cornelius Thorne had gone from one of the most influential religious figures in the county to a man facing both ecclesiastical censure and potential criminal prosecution, his name becoming synonymous with the very corruption he had once claimed to oppose. The transformation in how society regarded Eleanor was equally swift and far more personally satisfying. The same people who had come to the memorial service expecting to witness her humiliation now competed for her attention and favor, suddenly remembering connections to her late father or claiming they had always sensed something special about her during her governess years. Invitations flooded into Blackwood Manor, requests for her presence at dinners and balls, solicitations for her patronage of various charitable causes, carefully worded notes from families with eligible sons suddenly interested in courting a wealthy young duchess. Eleanor received these overtures with grace but without illusion, understanding that their newfound respect was built not on genuine recognition of her worth, but on fear of her demonstrated willingness to wield power against those who wronged her. She accepted some invitations and declined others according to her own judgment, establishing from the outset that she would navigate society on her own terms rather than according to others' expectations of proper ducal behavior. More meaningful were the private visits from women who had suffered under Bishop Thorne's schemes, who came to Blackwood Manor not seeking favor, but offering gratitude and kinship. These conversations, held in the drawing room over tea, revealed the true scope of the bishop's predation and the loneliness of those who had carried their shame in silence. A widow who had donated her late husband's entire estate to the church's mission work and been left nearly destitute. A young woman whose youthful indiscretion had been discovered by Thorne and held over her for years of escalating payments. A family who had been convinced that their deceased son's soul required special intercessions that somehow always demanded more gold. Eleanor listened to each story with the focused attention of someone who understood intimately what it meant to be powerless in the face of institutional authority. And with each conversation her resolve deepened. The fortune Sebastian had left her would not be hoarded or spent on frivolous display, but deployed strategically to help those whom society's systems had failed. Lady Cordelia and Lord Marcus, finding their campaign to paint Eleanor as an opportunist completely undermined, attempted a strategic retreat by simply avoiding her presence altogether. But Eleanor, having discovered that she rather enjoyed the exercise of power when used justly, made it known through careful social channels that she bore no personal grudge against Sebastian's cousins. They had acted according to their nature and their circumstances, protecting what they believed was rightfully theirs. This magnanimity, unexpected from someone who could have easily crushed them socially, had the paradoxical effect of making her appear even more formidable. Society began to whisper that the new Duchess of Blackwood possessed not only wealth and courage, but something more dangerous, wisdom and strategic restraint. She became someone to be respected rather than merely feared, someone whose approval carried weight precisely because it was not freely or thoughtlessly given. Yet for all the external transformation in her circumstances, Eleanor found herself returning repeatedly to Sebastian's study in the quiet hours of evening, rereading the letters he had left her and wrestling with complicated grief. She mourned not the loss of a husband in the conventional sense. They had been married less than a day, had shared no life together beyond those final intense hours, but rather the loss of a possibility, a connection that had barely begun to form before death severed it. She grieved for what might have been if Sebastian had found the courage to truly see her earlier, if illness had not forced his hand, if they had been given even a few months to explore the partnership his letters suggested he had begun to imagine. The vindication she had achieved felt hollow in moments when she allowed herself to acknowledge that what she wanted most, to thank Sebastian properly, to tell him that his faith in her had not been misplaced, to know him as more than words on a page, was forever impossible. The justice she had won for others could not undo the fundamental loneliness of her position. Wealthy and respected, but ultimately still alone in ways that society's approval could never quite address. 6 months after the memorial service that had changed everything, Eleanor stood in the grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor, hosting her first major social event as Duchess, a charity gala to raise funds for a new foundation she had established to assist women in financial distress. The ballroom blazed with candlelight reflecting off crystal chandeliers, and the cream of society moved through the space in their finest evening wear, no longer whispering about her origins, but about her accomplishments. She had used Sebastian's fortune exactly as he had hoped she would, establishing schools for girls whose families could not afford education, creating a legal fund to help widows navigate inheritance disputes, and partnering with reformers working to expose corruption in ecclesiastical and government institutions. The foundation bore Sebastian's name rather than her own, a choice that society interpreted as appropriate modesty, but which Eleanor understood as something more personal, a way of keeping alive the connection to the man who had seen her worth when she had been invisible to everyone else, including sometimes herself. As Eleanor moved through the ballroom accepting congratulations and managing the complex social choreography of such an event, she found her attention drawn repeatedly to a portrait that now hung prominently on the ballroom's east wall. It was a painting of Sebastian, commissioned during the early years of his marriage to Marianne, showing him as he had been before grief had hollowed him out, confident, vital, with a hint of warmth in his dark eyes that Eleanor had only glimpsed in his final hours. She had discovered the portrait stored in the attic, covered in dust and deliberately hidden away, presumably because Sebastian had found it too painful to look at a version of himself that no longer existed. Eleanor had it restored and prominently displayed not as a shrine, but as an honest acknowledgement of the man's complexity. He had been neither the cold tyrant his cousins remembered, nor the perfect Saint Bishop Thorne had eulogized, but something more interesting and human, someone capable of both withdrawal and generosity, of making mistakes and attempting to correct them. The evening's keynote speech was delivered by a respected magistrate who had been instrumental in pursuing legal action against Bishop Thorne, and his words painted Eleanor as a figure of remarkable courage who had risked everything to expose corruption and protect others. The assembled guests applauded enthusiastically, and Eleanor accepted their praise with grace. But inside she felt the complicated truth that public narratives always simplified. She had not been purely courageous, she had been terrified, had spent the night before the memorial service seriously considering surrender, had acted not from noble principle alone, but from anger and wounded pride, and a desperate need to prove that she mattered. The vindication she had achieved was real and meaningful, but it had not erased her loneliness, or answered the deeper questions about who she was beyond her role as Sebastian's widow and Thorne's vanquisher. She had become someone important, someone with agency and influence, but she sometimes missed the quiet invisibility of her governess years when the world's expectations had been simpler, even if its treatment of her had been crueler. Late in the evening, as the gala wound down and guests began to depart, Mr. Pemberton approached Eleanor with an unusual request. There was, he explained carefully, one final provision in Sebastian's will that he had been instructed not to reveal until 6 months had passed. A sealed letter addressed to Eleanor personally, to be delivered only after she had time to establish herself independently and make her own choices about how to use the inheritance and navigate society. The solicitor handed her an envelope bearing Sebastian's seal and handwriting, its weight suggesting multiple pages, and excused himself to allow her privacy. Eleanor stood alone in the emptying ballroom, the sounds of departure echoing from the entrance hall, and broke the seal with trembling fingers, unfolding pages that had been written by a man who had tried to imagine her future and leave one last message to guide her through it. Sebastian's final letter began with an apology for the intrusion. If she was reading this, he wrote, it meant she had survived the initial storm of scandal and established herself as Duchess, had presumably dealt with Bishop Thorne using the evidence he had provided, and had begun to discover what kind of life she wanted to build. He wanted her to know that everything he had done, the marriage, the inheritance, the evidence compilation, had been motivated not by obligation or abstract principle, but by genuine care for her specifically, for the woman he had watched for 3 years and come to admire long before illness forced his hand. He confessed that he had been a coward in his grief, had used Marianne's death as an excuse to withdraw from all human connection, had wasted years in which he might have known Eleanor as a friend and equal rather than an invisible employee. His greatest hope, he wrote, was that she would not make the same mistake, that having fought for her dignity and secured her independence, she would not retreat into isolation as he had done, would not let bitterness or caution prevent her from opening her heart to new possibilities, new connections, perhaps even new love if she found someone worthy of the extraordinary woman he had finally learned to see. Sebastian's final words released something in Eleanor that she had not known she was holding back, permission to imagine a future that was not defined solely by vindication or duty, but by the possibility of genuine happiness on her own terms. In the months that followed, she began to live rather than merely survive, hosting salons where artists and intellectuals gathered regardless of their social standing, traveling to London to meet with reformers and politicians working on causes she cared about, even cautiously accepting the courtship of a widowed earl, whose intelligence and kindness reminded her that not all men of privilege were cold or calculating. She never forgot Sebastian or the gift he had given her, but she stopped treating his memory as a weight to carry and began to see it as a foundation upon which to build something entirely her own. The girl who had once been invisible, who had accepted invisibility as her natural condition, had transformed into a woman who understood that true power came not from birth or wealth, but from the courage to stand visible in one's own truth, regardless of the cost. The final resolution of Bishop Thorne's case came nearly a year after Eleanor's revelation, when he was formally defrocked and sentenced to imprisonment for fraud and extortion. Eleanor attended the proceedings not out of vindictiveness, but out of respect for the other victims, who had found their voices because she had found hers first. Watching the man who had tried to steal her dignity led away in chains, she felt not triumph, but a profound sadness for all the years his corruption had operated unchecked, all the people who had suffered in silence because they believed powerful institutions were beyond challenge. Yet there was satisfaction too, the knowledge that Sebastian's final act had been to create ripples of justice that extended far beyond his own death, that his choice to see her worth had ultimately protected dozens of others from predation. The courtroom was filled with women and families Thorne had victimized, and as they filed out after the verdict, several stopped to thank Eleanor, not as subjects thanking a duchess, but as equals acknowledging someone who had fought a battle they all shared. Eleanor returned to Blackwood Manor that evening to find young Caroline, now nearly grown and preparing for her own debut in society, waiting in the drawing room with news. She had been accepted to a women's college that Eleanor had helped fund, one of the first institutions in England to offer rigorous academic education to young women, regardless of their family's wealth or connections. Caroline threw her arms around Eleanor in excitement, chattering about courses in literature and philosophy, about the chance to use her mind for something beyond securing an advantageous marriage. Eleanor held the girl who had once been her student, and felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that Sebastian's fortune was creating possibilities that would echo through generations. Women who would never have to choose between education and survival, who would enter the world with tools to defend themselves against exploitation, who would be visible not because a man saw them, but because they had learned to see themselves. As autumn gave way to winter, and Eleanor prepared for her second Christmas as Duchess of Blackwood, she finally felt ready to make a change she had been contemplating for months. She commissioned a second portrait to hang beside Sebastian's in the ballroom, not of herself alone, but of the two of them together, painted from imagination and description by an artist skilled in such reconstructions. The painting showed them as they might have been if time had allowed, seated together in the library she had loved and he had tolerated, books surrounding them, his hand resting gently on her shoulder while she held a volume open in her lap, both of them looking not at the viewer but at each other with expressions that suggested conversation, partnership, mutual respect. It was a fiction, a vision of a marriage that had never existed beyond a few desperate hours and countless letters, but it was also a truth, a representation of what they had recognized in each other, even if circumstances had prevented its full realization. On Christmas Eve, Eleanor stood before the paired portraits as snow fell softly outside the ballroom windows, and she spoke aloud to the image of the man who had changed her life through his death. She told him that his faith had not been misplaced, that she had used his gifts wisely and well, that she had fought his battles and won them without losing herself in the process. She thanked him for seeing her when she was invisible, for valuing her when society deemed her worthless, for leaving her not just wealth, but the weapons and wisdom to wield it justly. And she promised him that she would keep building on the foundation he had laid, would keep fighting for those whom the world tried to render invisible, would live fully and courageously in honor of the man who had given her everything, including permission to become someone neither of them could have predicted. Dear listener, Eleanor's story reminds us that our worth is not determined by whether others choose to see us, but by whether we have the courage to see ourselves. In a world that will always try to diminish those without power or privilege, the greatest act of resistance is to refuse invisibility, to speak truth even when it costs us, to recognize that vindication comes not from changing others' opinions, but from standing firm in the knowledge of our own value. We may not all inherit fortunes or expose corrupt bishops, but we each face the choice Eleanor faced, to accept the limitations others place upon us, or to discover within ourselves the strength to rewrite our own stories. The question is not whether we deserve happiness and respect. We do inherently and absolutely, but whether we possess the courage to claim them when the world insists we should settle for less.